Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Next Big Idea Club. We are talking today with the great Lisa Feldman Barrett, author of this terrific book, Seven and a Half, not seven, seven and a half lessons about the brain. Just a remarkable, I want to talk as a writer a little bit more about this book once we get into the content of it. So Lisa, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Where are we talking to you from? Where are you
This
right
is my
now? It looks, you have this like rich red curtain behind you.
this is my home office. This is where I do all of my writing. Even much of my academic writing also occurs in this room.
Nice. Okay. So, and that is in, tell us where.
Newton, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston, literally right next door.
The mean streets of Newton, Massachusetts. All right. Well, so again, because this is the pandemic era, I'm talking to you from my home office in Washington, D.C., which is a converted garage behind my house. So, Lisa, this is like the most obvious question you ask in a book interview, but I want to ask this question, which is, why did you write this book?
I wrote the book for a personal reason, which is, well, let me just say, there's never really one reason why you write a book, right? There are usually more than one. Um, for the personal reason for me was that I've always really loved essays, and I've always wanted to try my hand at writing essays. Um, and that allowed me to, I guess, fulfill another goal, which was to try to write science for the public, particularly for people who don't think of themselves as people who like science,
Hmm.
to really invite them to learn some really cool stuff about how their brain works, and then maybe to use that information as a tool for living. Since that really is what science is for, that's what philosophy is for, that's what history is for, and so on.
Nice. Okay. So maybe we can focus our conversation on that. We can talk about, so what do we know about the brain, and then how do we use that insight as a tool for living, as you put it in a very lovely way. So the first thing, all right, so straight out of the box, we start this book, you discover something that came as a surprise, I think, to me, to other lay people, which is this, is that it turns out our brain is not for thinking. What?
I
Lisa,
know, so cool
what's
though,
going
right?
on? What is that about?
I know but it's so cool. That's the thing. It's so cool. So the oftentimes what scientists do when they're talking about brains and how brains work and so on is they look at adult brains and they compare them. But if you look at embryos and how embryos produce brains, and you look at animals, many different animals across the animal kingdom, some of whom, their environment hasn't really changed very much in like 400 million years. So they themselves have not changed very much in like 400 million years. You can put together a story about brain evolution. And when you look back to the really just before brains evolved, just before a brain makes its appearance, you see this little creature, which I wrote about, Amphioxus or a lancelet, which you can Google them and look at them on YouTube. They're these really cute little. They look like little fish, except they have gills for breathing, and you know, they kind of wriggle, and then they sort of plant themselves in the sand, and then they just filter food. And they don't have a head, they don't have senses in the conventional sense, and they have a clump of cells at the tip of the front end of their body, but they don't really have a brain. And so, if you actually look at how brains evolve by looking at the evolutionary trajectory, what you can see is that brains evolved pretty much as bodies get bigger, as senses develop, as the environment for an animal gets bigger, which we call a niche. So as the senses develop, the niche gets bigger, the body gets bigger, and you get a brain. And what this suggests is that brains evolved. You can't really say why a brain evolved, but one of its most important jobs in evolution during this evolutionary trajectory is to control the body.
Hmm.
And this story is very nicely consistent with what we can see in brain anatomy, not just in our brains, but really in brains in general. That in general, it tends to be the case that the parts of the brain that are most important, for example, for understanding language, for memory, for a lot of things that are important to being human, also happen to be important for regulating the systems of your body.
So we've got this little creature which you describe in the book as a stomach on a stick, all right? And that stomach on the stick, like all organisms, its goal is to survive. And the goal of every organism is essentially to survive, right?
Well, to survive long enough to pass your genes on to the next generation, or sometimes scientists will say to pass your genes on to the next generation and allow those offspring to survive to reproductive age.
Okay, got it. So your goal is to get to your goal is to get your genes transmitted in some way, all right? And a way to do that is obviously if you're dead, it's hard to transmit your genes.
Right.
So being the biologist that I am, that's the weighty conclusion that I've come to. And so the stomach on a stick is trying to survive. And you're saying that our brain is not for thinking per se. Our brain is for budgeting, essentially. Just give us a little bit on what that concept means, because I think it's a really interesting.
Sure.
It's a really interesting metaphor. Our brain is not for thinking. Our brain is for budgeting resources.
Right. So I think that the thing to understand the way that scientists work is that they often approach their topics of study with a set of beliefs or judgments that they hope that they put into the background. But one thing that you can see, I think, in looking at a lot of neuroscience work is that the characteristics that we value about ourselves as a species is rationality and or even sometimes, like vision, like we have this amazing visual system with a lot of detail. And so the things we value about ourselves are the things that really sometimes guide our inquiry into how brains evolved or how they work. And we have a story that really was bequeathed to us from ancient Greece, which is really a morality tale, actually, about how we understand when we're responsible for our behavior and who exactly is the most responsible and so on, which was tattooed essentially onto the brain as an evolutionary story in the mid-20th century. And that's the story of, you have a lizard brain or reptile brain for instincts, and overlaid on top of that, you have what's called a limbic system, limbic meaning border. So these are regions that border the instincts for emotion. And these two together are your inner beast, this roiling, inner beast, which has to be controlled by rationality, which was assigned to your very big cerebral cortex. It's a great story. It's just, and it's intuitive. It's just that it doesn't actually comport with what we know about brain evolution. And
let me see you and raise you with your own words there, Lisa. You say that this idea of a triune brain, that is the lizard, limbic, and neocortex, the triune brain is one of the most successful and widespread errors in all of science.
Yeah, I stand by that. I stand by that claim. And I stand by that claim because, there's so much to say about this that it's hard to know where to start. But this myth is the foundation of the legal system in the United States and in many legal systems in the West. It's the foundation of economic theory. So, now economists acknowledge that we're not always rational, but we're often irrational, but markets are rational, but humans are irrational. But still, there's this idea that your brain is a battleground for emotion versus reason. And you can't look at the brain, you can't look at any brain, but you certainly can't look at a human brain and say, well, these parts are for emotion and they're battling these parts for rationality. Even though scientists do this all the time, it just makes no sense from an anatomical standpoint. When you look at the structure of the brain, it doesn't make any sense based on the functioning of the brain and so on. And the irony here, right, is that scientists pretty much had discovered by the mid-1970s, using genetics, molecular genetics, and other kinds of tools that allow us to peer deep into the mechanisms of cells. They knew pretty much then that the brain didn't evolve in sedimentary layers like sedimentary rock, or as I prefer to think of it, it's like the birthday cake view of the brain. Like you've got this already baked cake you know, instincts and emotion on which you overlay icing, which is the cerebral cortex. And your brain doesn't work like that. It's not structured that way. It didn't evolve that way. But yet, Carl Sagan put it into a book that won a Pulitzer Prize in 1977, and poof, we have this story which appears still in many textbooks in medicine. And it, like I said, it's the basis of the law. It's the basis of economics. It is in, I can't even hundreds, if not thousands of, leadership training courses in industry. And it's false.
And the punchline here is that we have the only creatures with a lizard brain are lizards.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that you and I and all our other bipedal brothers and sisters have one brain, not three.
Exactly.
And you also say that our brains, if you look at, say, well, give us a sense. How are our brains like and unlike other organisms?
Yeah. So there's this. So there's some. Well, I think this is really cool stuff. So there's this neuroscientist. Her name is Barbara Finley. She's one of the smartest people I know. She's really quite brilliant, and she's discovered by studying mammalian brains, so cats and dogs and rats and elephants and so on, that all mammals have the same neurons, and they have the same developmental plan for their brain, which is 271 stages that begin with an embryo. So when an embryo is developing, it's giving birth, it's birthing essentially, or creating neurons, all the way from there to what's considered to be the finished stage of an adult brain. Adult brains still have changing going on, but it's slower. And in a human brain, it's in fewer areas. And so what she's discovered is that in these 271 steps, every species she's ever studied of mammals follows brain development in exactly the same order. And what's changing really is the duration of each time point, how long it runs for. And so when a time point runs for longer, that stage produces more cells or more wiring or whatever is happening at that stage. So that's what's similar, meaning when you look at a rat who doesn't look like they have very much, of a cerebral cortex, and you look at a human who looks like they have a lot, or an elephant who looks like they have even more on the surface, that's what it looks like to us. What's happening actually is that the brain was formed from exactly the same plan. And the really cool thing, if that isn't cool enough, is that when you look at other vertebrates, that is, other animals that have a backbone and a head, because it turns out a head and senses are also innovations of the vertebrate line. When you look at animals who are vertebrates, it looks like they pretty much follow the same plan, maybe not exactly, but pretty close. And so what that means is that out of this single plan, you can get all these brains which look differently to the naked eye, but whose neurons are largely the same. They're just configured in different ways. And the neuroscientist George Streeter wrote in his book on brain evolution, a fantastic book, by the way, for anyone who wants to dig a little deeper into the science. He wrote that as brains grow, they reorganize like companies. And so that's why it looks like we have this really big cerebral cortex, whereas a mouse looks like they have really a very small one, and an iguana looks like, maybe they don't even have one at all. Despite that fact, the neurons are pretty much the same. And that's really cool. In terms of differences, I would say there are a number of differences that are interesting. The two I think that maybe are most important here. One is that human brains are born under development much more than other brains. So the 271 steps are happening in the same order, but where birth occurs right, can vary
Right.
along that
Right. And I want
plan.
to get to I want to get to what happens to our baby brains,
Yeah,
because
but
to
I'll
me
just say, but
that's one of the
yeah,
most fascinating chapters, one of the
yeah.
most
So
fascinating chapters in the book. But I mean,
that's one
I
thing.
think that what you're saying is that our brains have a lot of similarities with other vertebrates, at least, that we're following the same basic plan.
Yeah,
We have the same basic brain cells, neurons. It's just that the conditions in which they evolved are different, and that leads to differentiation. That our
yeah.
brains are, I mean, our brain, like, I mean, here's, I mean, this is the kind of thing that makes people who don't know anything about science crazy. I mean, I'll read you one of your lines when you say, our brains are not more evolved than a lizard's brains.
Well, sure, because
They're
lizards
just
are
differently
really,
evolved.
they're just differently evolved. Exactly. Lizards are really well adapted to their niche, and we're really well adapted to ours. But our niche, I mean, there are only one class of animals, I think, who have larger niche than we do, and that would be bacteria and other single cell organisms. We have a huge
Yeah.
niche, right? And that's, you know, partly because, or partly related to the fact that our brains are born under construction, and it means that brains can wire themselves to their world. The other thing that's different about a human brain is that our brains are super expensive, metabolically speaking. Our brains
Mm.
are about 20% of our entire metabolic budget. A chimp's, for example, is about nine. So that's a huge increase, and the reason why it has to do with the functioning of neurons in particular, and the number of neurons and the functioning. Well, not so much the number of neurons, more the connections between neurons in particular parts of the cerebral cortex that allow us to reason abstractly, and that's really lesson seven. Um, so um, so those are the two big differences. There are others, but those are the two big ones.
Okay, so here's what we know so far. We know that our brain is not for thinking. It's essentially a CFO of our bodily budget,
Yeah.
regulating things, making sure we survive and pass our genes to the next generation. All this stuff that you all have heard about the lizard brain and the limbic system and those three layers of brains and the higher level, so-called higher level, keeping the others in check. Not true, says Lisa. All right, so
It's
we
not just
dispelled
me. I
two.
mean, it's not, you don't have to listen to me. You can go read the
No,
actual
you
scientific papers.
listen to you as the representative of
Yes, yes.
neuroscience, not the rather than who I think we should trust neuroscientists when it comes to neuroscience, not corporate trainers who have a slide of a lizard.
Indeed.
So let's move on there. I want to something else I found interesting about this, and it's germane to my life right now. So I am having a problem with my computer today, no joke. And the problem that I'm having with my computer is my hard drive. My hard drive is filling up for reasons I can't understand. Now, I had always thought truly that memories are the way that we create the way our brains make memories is similar to what happens on my hard drive on my computer. That memories are somehow stored in our brain. And you say in lesson two, tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's been known for some time that that memories are what your brain is doing when it's remembering is it's reconstructing a past experience in the firing and conversation between neurons. Unfortunately, the very people who did this seminal and really quite amazing and important work um, also continue to use language like my your that that memories are stored and retrieved. So memories are not stored in your brain, and they are not retrieved like file folders or like files. Your brain is made of 128, give or take, billion neurons plus other cells called glial cells, and the neurons are basically passing information back and forth to one another in a pattern. And so when your brain is remembering something, when you remember something, when you imagine something, when you think something, when you feel something, no matter what is happening, what your brain is doing is it's re-implementing patterns from the past, from your past experiences. And your brain can do this in what's called a generative way, meaning your brain can take bits and pieces of past experience and combine them in new ways. And so always it's the case, you could say that your brain is constructing, or your brain is re-implementing, or your brain is rebuilding experiences from the past. And that is what memory is, actually.
It is not retrieving;
It is
it's
not
assembling.
retrieving,
So
it's
if
assembling.
you were to ask me, if at the moment right now, so inside of my head, I'm
Hmm.
remembering the best basketball game I played in seventh grade. Okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm actually assembling that. I'm not going into the hard drive and saying and
Correct.
pluck 1979
Yeah,
or whatever. Here's
correct.
what.
But here's a really cool thing, Dan.
Yeah,
So take that basketball game.
yeah,
Can you conjure any like sights? Like can you remember?
absolutely.
And yeah, so you can see certain things that you saw. And can
Right.
you hear anything, maybe like a ghost of a sound, some sounds
Perhaps,
like?
perhaps,
Hmm.
perhaps, perhaps. I
Yeah.
mean, I do feel like the yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
the fidelity is a little lower, but it's definitely, So here's the really cool thing. When you have a memory, when you're remembering and you see something in your mind's eye, your brain is changing the firing of its own neurons. So you can see something in your mind's eye, without any visual input. So like when you hear a song going through your head that you cannot get out of your head, no matter what you do, you're what's happening is that your brain is
yeah.
reassembled the neural pattern. So it's changing the firing of the neurons that are important for hearing, for audition, so that you hear a song in your head, even though there's no song playing out in the world. And different scientists have called this process different names. Memory, it's sometimes called simulation, it's sometimes
Mm.
called imagination, it's sometimes called perceptual inference. This is sort of how you know that a process is really important in science, because a bunch of scientists give it different names. And then, but really, they're all talking about the same thing.
Okay, so when we remember our brains are assembling, our brain is really a network, a vast and complicated network. All right, so
Hmm.
that's what we know. Now let's go back to something you said earlier, which to me one of the I mean the whole book I have to say is just so well done. It's written with such clarity and such concision that it it's really quite remarkable. It helped me understand so much. That's why I love this book so much. But I really love the chapter on babies' brains, and let's spend a little bit of time on that. What you said before, are other species when the youngsters are born, their brains are fairly completed. Human brains are under construction, as you say. Tell us what you mean by that, and then tell us how that construction happens, and I think surprisingly, for how long?
Yeah, so think about a horse or a calf. They're born, and within an hour they're up on their feet and walking around. Or you think about a chimpanzee, they're also really adorable, right? They're these tiny little things, and they're come out of their mother's uterus. They're born, and they can within an hour or two they're clinging to their mother's fur or hair. Actually, turns out it's not. There's no difference really. Now these animals, their brains also will develop over time too, but when they're born, their brains are they're a little more baked than ours. Okay, when a human is born, the human brain is really incomplete. It has all of its neurons, more or less. There are some parts of the brain that are still birthing neurons throughout your whole life, but very few, where you have new neurons being born. Largely, what's going to change is the wiring. It's the how neurons are connected to one another and how they speak to each other. And little babies are their brains are they can't even burp by themselves. I mean, they can't do anything. So we didn't really get into the details of body budgeting, but I think the thing to say is, your brain and my brain and most adult brains, neurotypical brains, can regulate the body they're attached to, not completely by themselves, but to a large degree. Babies' brains can't do this. They're not The wiring isn't complete. And so the brains are waiting for a set of wiring instructions from the world. Those wiring instructions partially come from the physical world. So the physical world, that is the sights and sounds and smells and so on that a baby is exposed to, will influence the wiring of that baby's brain. But surprisingly, to a surprising degree, the wiring also comes from the infant's social world. Mm-hmm. That is the extent to which you make eye contact with the baby, the extent to which you speak to the baby or sing to the baby, whether you carry the baby in front or on the back or in a stroller, whether you put the baby to sleep, rock the baby to sleep, or allow her to go to sleep on her own, to learn to go to sleep on her own. All of these things are, in fact, everything that you do is curating a world that will wire that infant's brain. And this continues more or less for about 25 years.
25.
So the idea here, what scientists have discovered, is that although there are some parts of the brain that develop a little more early and some that continue developing for a longer time, generally speaking, it takes 25 years to fully bake an adult brain, human brain.
Yeah, that makes me feel better about my first 25 years. But I think the idea here, which I think is so important, I mean, when you talk about a tool for living, this is the one area where I think it gives us some instructions on how to configure society in some way. Because what you're saying essentially is that baby brains, kid brains, are not miniature adult brains. They're still under construction. And the only way they can complete construction effectively is through inputs from the outside world, from their social environment, but also from their caregivers. The caregivers, I happen to have a rubber duck on my desk. If I show a little baby, hey, here's a little rubber ducky, right? What am I doing? I'm helping that baby wire her attention. Where should she focus her that's part of her. It's part of her brain. It's part of her brain. It's part of her brain development. And so here's the question for you. This is, and you have this, the fairly well-known account of what happened in Romania when kids, when they took orphans, and orphans, their physical needs, feeding essentially was taken care of, but nothing else. And those kids were in horrible shape. Those kids did not develop because they lacked the inputs from the social world. Now, here's my question for you, Lisa. I read that chapter, and I'll show you. I mean, I'm going to show you viewers what I wrote at the end of that chapter because I found it so compelling. Hang on a second. This is going to be worth the wait, viewers. Hang on. Okay, here we go. So here's my note right there. If you can see that in the. Okay, I'll read it to you, but I just want to say. Okay, so basically, what you said, what you're saying is that we have this period where those of us who are adults have an effect, and those of us who build societies have an effect on the development of children's brains. To me, I read that and it's like, why isn't more public policy geared toward that very end? Why don't we have as a central aim of public policy the nourishment and construction of tiny brains?
Exactly. So now I'm going to take off my lab coat.
Good.
And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to echo what you said, and I'm going to add to it.
Go for it.
In the United States, we have laws about foreseeability, that is, foreseeable harm. If you get behind the wheel of a car and you are under the influence of alcohol, you are held responsible for any harm that you bring to another person because you could foresee that you should know that that drinking doesn't, if your blood alcohol level is too high, you won't be able to control the car very well. That's why people are convicted for drunk driving. So the same thing is true of poverty and neglect. And when I say neglect, I'm talking about extreme circumstances. So poverty is a foreseeable harm for an infant brain. This is not metaphorical. And there are no studies that deny this. There are certainly are some kids who are more resilient than other kids. There's no question about that. And that's an important topic for study. But all brains are harmed, meaning even if you take a resilient kid, if you grew that brain in an environment that was enriched, that brain would do much better than it would otherwise. And it also means that things like separating children from their caregivers under any circumstances other than if the caregiver can't care for the child or is abusive to the child is just not justified. It's just not justified from the perspective of a developing brain. And so we have politics.
I'll see you and raise you. I'll say that it's an act of overt harm.
Yeah, I think it's an act of overt harm. It's what I would say is it's an act of foreseeable harm.
Okay, better said.
Foreseeable harm.
Yeah.
And to add sort of insult to injury, I'll just say this and then I'll try to put my lab coat back on. The National Academies of Sciences did a study on childhood poverty and showed that it would actually be cheaper. It's not going to be cheap to solve this problem, but it would be cheaper to solve childhood poverty than it is to deal with the consequences of that poverty 20 years later when those little brains are now young adults and engaging in, behavior that maybe, otherwise is not really advisable. The way that I decided to try to talk about this, since politics gets in the way of morality, of discussions of morality, is to just talk about it really in pragmatic terms. If you're a business person, you're a business leader, you should care a lot about this because those kids are the workers of the next generation. So just from a human capital standpoint, this is nuts. It's really, really nuts. And it's like pouring human capital down the drain, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, to me, it's so compelling. And so it's compelling as a public policy matter. It's also compelling in the way we think about things and again, getting back to your idea of a tool for living, which is that, we like to talk in these simple-minded terms about nature and nurture. There's a guy at Yale named Craig Wright who's a musician and he teaches a course in genius. And on the first day of class, when we're talking about whether genius is nature or nurture, he has a student stand up and say, there is no answer, there is no answer, there is no answer. You have a more nuanced response to that, which helped me sort this out, which is that nature needs nurture, nurture needs nature. That they work together.
I think there's, it's not that there's no answer, it's that there's more than one answer, but all the answers have something in common. And that is that we have the kind of nature that requires nurture. We have the kind of genes, in fact, most animals have the kind of genes that are turned on and off by their environment. So, initially when scientists were studying genes, they found that I think between 5 and 10% of the DNA in our bodies are genes. And the rest of it they called junk because they weren't genes. But it turns out what lurks in that junk makes you who you are. Though that junk is really for what's called epigenetics, that is how the environment turns on and off genes to make you who you are. And so this is really, really important, that for the most part, genes are necessary, but not sufficient cause of anything about you. So environment is important. And I think here it's important to say, anyone who's really interested in this might want to read some work by Alison Gopnik, the psychologist who's at Berkeley, because she wrote she's written several books which are terrific, but one book in particular called The Gardener and the Carpenter.
Yep.
And she basically makes this point that, we want to curate an environment, curate an environment for our kids that will let them become who they're going to become, not to train them to be, a world, class cellist or a world-class pianist or a world-class physicist, but more give them a lot of opportunities to experiment, to discover, to play in a way that is play meaning, like forage for new experiences in a way that will help them find their own path. And the goal here is to, just in the same way that you would fortify soil in order to let lots of different plants grow, you want to give kids enough input to let them figure out what they, what their strengths are, what their desires are, what their enjoyment is, and passion is, and so on.
Yep. And especially for kids who are less well off, who are living in more barren environments, you want to have the nutrients in the soil. You want to have the sunshine.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
It's almost pre-gardening in a sense, in that it's the basic elements that allow those young plants to those young plants to survive. The key idea here, I want to summarize this before we move on, is that little brains wire themselves to the world. That we come into the world with our brains under construction, and that our environment, our caregivers, and the social world help us construct those brains. And it's a long process.
It's a long process.
25 years. 25 years to build that brain. That gives you a sense of what the complexity is. Now, here's something else that blew my mind. I guess I can use that phrase here, although I don't know where my brain is and where my mind is right now. But so you say this. Well, I'm going to read you something. Neuroscientists like to say that our day-to-day experiences, wait for this, because those of you watching at home might be having this experience right now. Our day-to-day experiences are a carefully controlled hallucination. All right, so I'm hallucinating now. What do you mean by that?
Yes. So, I'm starting to know where to start, but so remember when we were talking about your basketball game that you remembered?
Yes.
Yeah, and in your mind's eye, you could sort of see things that were a little bit similar during the game, and maybe hear things and so on. What your brain is doing is it's controlling the firing, changing the firing of its own neurons to conjure those experiences for you. So that's actually how your brain works all the time in everyday life. That is what your brain is doing all the time. To us, it feels as if we see stuff and we hear stuff and then we react to it. But under the hood, that is not the way your brain works. Instead, what's happening is that your brain is constantly making predictions. It's constantly reassembling past experiences to predict what's going to happen next, to predict what you will do next, to predict what you will see, what you will hear, what you will feel, and so on. So it changes the firing of its own neurons as a way of predicting, and then sense data from the world, the wavelengths of light that are sights, and the changes in air pressure that become sounds, and so on. This sense data reaches your brain. Same thing with, sense data from your body, from all that body budgeting that's going on, from changes in your heartbeat and in the expansion of your lungs and from your immune system and so on. All of this sense data reaches your brain. If your brain is already firing, its prediction matches the data that's coming in, then your brain's already firing in a way that would capture that input. So the sense data from the world just confirms the prediction, and that becomes your experience. No more information makes it into your brain if you've predicted correctly. So it is a hallucination that is controlled by anything outside your brain.
Because our brains are prediction engines in a way.
Correct.
Now let's. There's a great example of in the book. I think this really makes the case. Tell me what happens. Tell us what happens when you're. Tell me what's okay. We'll use me as the participant here. I'm thirsty. Come back from a run. I'm thirsty. I drink a glass of water.
Yeah. So I love this. So when you're thirsty and you drink a glass of water, immediately you drink until your thirst is quenched. So you might drink a whole 8 ounces or 12 ounces of water from a glass. Your thirst is quenched. The thing is that the water takes about 20 minutes to make it into your bloodstream, to get to your brain to change the osmol. So it takes about 20 minutes for the osmolarity of your blood to change, and for that information to make it to your brain, that sense data to make it to your brain to say, hey, hydration complete. So what is happening then when you feel your thirst is quenched immediately? And the answer
I
is,
feel my thirst is quenched. It's not really quenched. I'm
well,
hallucinating.
yeah. So what I would say is that your thirst is quenched, but the
My thirst
hydration
is
that
quenched. The water hasn't. That we haven't. We This is not a word I expected to use today. We haven't reached the proper level of osmolarity, as you said earlier,
yeah.
right? So
Yes.
we
Yeah.
haven't
So what
had
I would say,
hasn't.
yeah. So what I would say is, we use thirst usually to mean something physical, but thirst is an experience. And really what we're talking about is the hydration. How much water is in your body and how much hydration do you have? Same thing with hunger. We talk about hunger as being this physical thing, but hunger, pain also experiences, but there are physical components to those experiences, like how much glucose do you have in your bloodstream, for example, or in the case of pain, how much what's called nociception, that is signals about tissue damage, how much is that coming from your body and reaching your brain? So what's happening here is that based on a lifetime of experience of your brain learning an association between drinking water and a change in eventual change in the osmolarity of your blood, your brain is predicting. So basically it's if we were to stop time right now, just stop time, and we would peer into your brain would be representing things as they are in as what it believes to be the world right now and what's happening in the world in your body right now, and it's making a prediction based on what's going to happen next. So based on drinking water, your brain is predicting that your thirst will be quenched. But actually, it takes about 20 minutes for that change to happen. Similarly, when you eat, for example, when you eat food, um, your brain, if you eat very quickly, your brain is predicting that you're going to be full or not, perhaps. But it takes about 20 minutes actually for the actual information about glucose concentrations to make it to your brain. So if you eat slowly, there'll be more of a correspondence between what you're eating and what your brain is computing about the amount of nutrients that you're taking in. If you eat really quickly, there's going to be some lag between how much you've eaten and what your brain is tracking.
So eat slowly,
Eat slowly.
young men and women out there.
Yes, eat
Now, but
slowly.
this is quite fast. So in other words, just to put to sum it up here, our brains, it's crazy when you think. I mean,
Yeah,
it's crazy. Our
yeah,
brains don't react; we predict,
yeah.
and this happens completely outside of our awareness.
Completely outside of your awareness. Yeah. And the only way we can demonstrate this to people is by breaking those predictions, right? So by showing people things that they can't predict about, and then they have experiential blindness for what they're, for the information that they're being presented with. Um, and so, it makes for really fun presentations in a talk. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
So, but here's, can
I
I
don't
just,
know.
I'll
I
just
don't
say
know
this.
how we would react or how we would predict. You
Yeah.
know.
But here's another one that I just learned actually, which I just totally love. So you know how you're walking outside and you feel a drop or two of water on your skin, and you realize, oh, it's going to start raining. Okay, your skin, my skin doesn't have actual wetness receptors at all.
Hmm.
So where is this experience of wetness coming from? Like when you go out for a run and you feel all sweaty, your skin has no wetness receptors. So how do you know how is it that you're experiencing wetness on your skin? And the answer is, well, your brain is making predictions about temperature and about touch, for which it does have receptors, and it's
Hmm.
using that information to weave together in a complicated calculus the experience of wetness. So talk about a hallucination, man. That's like completely, you are experiencing something for which you have no receptors. I mean, like, that's just amazing to me. And I just love things like that.
It is interesting. I hadn't thought about this. It is a form in some ways of extrasensory perception.
Yeah, for
Uh,
sure, for
if you think
sure.
about, I mean, literally, if you
Yeah,
look at the,
yeah,
the literal the literal meaning of extrasensory, it's
yeah.
crazy. Let's. I'm going to move on to something else here, and then I want to talk a little bit about the implications. I think one of the interesting things in this book that I didn't expect to see, and maybe it's my own bias stereotype, is the importance in a book about neuroscience about words. And how important words are. In particular, about how much our brains are, we wire ourselves to other people's brains. And because of that, words have a pretty significant impact on us. Tell us about that.
Sure. So one of our great adaptive advantages as species is that we have language, and that means that we can communicate with each other very, very effectively, which is important for our ability to learn from one another. So you don't have to experience everything yourself in real time in order to learn about it. You can observe someone else, somebody could tell you a story, you can hear about somebody else's experience, and you can learn from that. So it's a very, very powerful tool that we have. And words also have other really amazing abilities. So, for example, even with a child as young as 3 months old, you can say to a child, "Look, sweetie, this is a wog." And then you put the wog down and it beeps. And then you say, "Look, sweetie, this is a wug." And then you put the wog down and it beeps. And now you take something else, which doesn't look the same, doesn't have the same shape, there's nothing about it physically which is the same. And you say, "Look, sweetie, this is a wug." And you put it down and the baby expects to hear it beep. What does that mean? That means that babies who are pre-verbal are using words to form abstract concepts where they can look at a bunch of objects that don't look the same, their surfaces aren't the same. There's nothing really physically about them that's the same, but the baby understands that they have the same function, that they perform the same function. This is a really remarkable thing. So how does this happen? And I don't think we know all the answers, but one thing we do know is that the parts of the brain which are most important for language also happen to be the parts that are most important for predicting, to launch the predictions in your brain. And they also happen to be the parts that are doing that body budgeting. So the parts of your brain that are most important for body budgeting, for regulating your breathing and your heart rate and your immune system and your metabolism and everything that goes on inside your body, those same brain regions are really important for the ability to understand language and to form sentences and communicate. And that means that words are really important in body budgeting. And that has both positive and unforeseen negative, potentially negative implications, especially now when we live in a culture that, there's a sort of casual brutality to the communications that people have with one another.
Well, so this is another mind blower to me, at least, and I say this as someone who was a linguistics major in college. The idea that words are a tool for regulating bodies is, to me, a remarkable concept. I spent 4 years studying linguistics, and that really was not part of how we thought about things. But it makes perfect sense to me. Now, let me just build on what you were saying before, because there's a lovely line in here that I want to read back to you here. The best thing for your nervous system is another human. The worst thing for your nervous system is also another human. So I think that's sort of where you were going on this,
Yeah,
about how we
exactly.
treat each other.
Exactly. So I think that, we are a social species. Lots of people have written about that. We evolved to support each other and so on. But being a social species really means that, amongst other things, that we're not just caretakers of our own body budgets. We're also caretakers of other people's body budgets, whether we like it or not, and whether we realize it or not. That is actually how things are working under the hood. And so I can text 3 little words to one of my closest friends who lives halfway across the world. And I can change her breathing and her And her heart rate. And in fact, today I published an article in the New York Times, and I got a text message from a really close friend of mine saying, I could hear your voice in my head, and it immediately gave me this really, really warm, tranquil feeling. So basically, or you can read the Bible or the Quran. You can read words from millennia past and find great comfort in those words. And what does that mean under the hood? It means that those words are regulating your body budget. But the alternative, or the flip side of that, is that things that you say can have be like, figuratively speaking, a withdrawal out of people's body budgets. And the same is true for you, that people, the way they speak to you, whether it doesn't have anything to do with being a snowflake or weak. This happens because you're human and you have a human nervous system. And so what this means for us really is that we have a fundamental dilemma in this country and in other countries that really value individual rights and freedoms. And that is that we have socially dependent nervous systems where we are the caretakers of each other's nervous systems, but we really value free speech and other individual rights and freedoms. And the thing that I find so kind of troubling as a person, but maybe fascinating as a scientist, is that people can't discuss this at all. I mean, if you even try to raise the issue, a lot of people become really irate. And yet, I think it's really something we have to be talking about, because whether we talk about it or not, the biology is what it is, and the consequences will be what they will be. And so we should be talking about it, and we should be trying to figure out what this means for us, in what it means for public discourse, and what it means for how to get along. And I just want to say as a caveat, I'm not saying people can't disagree with each other, and I'm not saying people can't debate. Certainly nobody would ever accuse me of saying that. But it really does matter how we speak to each other. It matters to whether or not we are, how much of a withdrawal we're making out of someone's body budget.
We have a right to speak our mind. We have a responsibility to treat other people with dignity.
Absolutely.
I think it's not much more complicated than that. But what you're making here, Lisa, which I think is profound, is that you're making a scientific case for that. And if you go back to those old stories that the ancient words, whether from any religious tradition, essentially tells us that.
Exactly.
So let's take a final few minutes here and talk about this. So we've got 7.5 lessons about the brain. We know that our brain is a network. We know that it's a prediction engine. We know that babies wire themselves to the world, and that's how they develop. We know that all of our brains are social. Our memories are assembled. There isn't one human nature. There are multiple natures. Question for you. So we're armed with this knowledge. Tell us how it becomes a tool for living. How can we go about our lives differently now that we've better informed about what our brains are about?
Yeah, so I think that once you understand a little bit about how your brain works, and you also understand that your brain is like a master of deception, it seamlessly creates experiences for you and gives you confidence that these experiences reveal how it works, when in fact, that is, nothing could be further from the truth. And I think, so knowing a little bit, in addition to the fact that, you will become the life of the party when we can go back to having parties, we can delight our friends with little fun tidbits at dinner parties and so on about how brains work. I think there are some real potential lessons here. So for example, and it's hard to it's hard to say this in a very pithy, concise way, because I think it really works on an example by example basis. So for an example, when your infant throws their Cheerios on the floor for the 99th time, remember that this infant's brain is wiring itself to its world. The infant's probably learning about physics, probably learning about gravity. And it's also, the child's also learning about your responsiveness to the child. So, my husband and I, when our daughter was very young, and she, it's not really a good idea to think about children as trying to manipulate you. But if you do think of it that way, because really what they're trying to do is have agency in the world. They're trying to see an effect of their own behavior. But if you do think of it that way, you should be at times applauding it rather than trying to subvert it, because that means that child's brain is learning how to be an effective agent in the world. And while it may annoy you when the child is 4, you will be delighted by it when the child is 20, turns out to be 25. So that's like one example. Or another example would be, I think, I don't know how you've been faring these days with COVID and everything else that's been going on politically. I know I am feeling at times very weary, and sometimes I feel like things just feel tremendously burdensome. And rates of depression are going up, which you could think of that as a bankrupt body budget, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do you do about it? Well, or things seem so uncertain, which leads to an increase in certain chemicals, which you experience as sort of an increase in arousal, not sexual arousal, but like agitation and kind of being worked up. And, we have go-to ways of making sense of these sensations. Feeling worked up is anxiety, feeling really weary and dragged out is depression. And before these go on for a really long time and become clinical disorders, there's an opportunity to intervene differently if you understand really what's happening. So when I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling particularly weary, my first thought is, what's going on with my body budget? Do I need to sleep more? Do I need to go out for a walk? Am I dehydrated? Do I need a hug from my husband? Do I need to give my daughter a hug? So do I need to do something nice for somebody else, which turns out to be actually somewhat of a deposit in your body budget and theirs, the research suggests. So instead of making sense of my sensations as negative emotions, which would lead me down one set of actions, I am thinking in terms of my physical body budgeting, and I'm making meaning of these sensations as physical in relation to physical body budgeting, which leads me down a path for a different set of actions. And if you understand that, you can make different choices for yourself, which will ultimately give you more control over your well-being. I just want to be really clear. I'm not saying that, you can just snap your fingers and then, take like post-traumatic stress disorder and evaporate it, or a clinical depression. But I am saying that on a day-to-day basis, for things that are not at that clinical level, we have a lot more control over our well-being and the well-being of those around us if we understand exactly a little bit more about how our brains work.
You're teaching us to think like a neuroscientist and use those neuroscientific principles on ourselves. Lisa, one last question. So, is that your goal with this book? Is that what do you want people to take away from this? Is it that ability to think about their brains in a different way and use that to regulate their lives more effectively?
Yeah, I think there are two sorts of things I want people to take away. One is I want people to have fun. I want people to read the book and enjoy learning some really fun, cool things. Neuroscience is cool. Science is cool. I think we've a little bit forgotten that, or maybe some people have. Scientists get portrayed as kind of stupid or evil in movies, but science is actually really cool. And I think everyone right now could use a little bit of a break and learn something really neat about your own brain, about that 3-pound blob between your ears. So in one sense, it's really about showing people how much fun you can have with neuroscience. And but I think that there's a deeper message too. And the deeper message is you can also use neuroscience to think about the kind of human that you want to be. You are more responsible for your behavior than you might know or like. And you are also more responsible for the well-being of other people than you might know or want. And that includes children, but not limited to children. And I think there are many, many, many opportunities for you to be your best self, whatever that means to you. So the lessons aren't written to tell you what to do. They're more written to get you to think about who you want to be and the ways, and provide you with tools to get there, basically. Yeah.
The book is 7.5, not 8, 7.5, 7.5 lessons about the brain. Lisa Feldman Barrett. It will help you become a better human being if you apply the lessons of neuroscience to your own life. Lisa, it has been a joy to hallucinate with you here this afternoon.
I'm happy to hallucinate with you anytime, Dan.